Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker was asked about cannabis during a Judiciary Committee hearing, specifically the status of applications for the expansion of government-approved cannabis production facilities for research purposes. This is following the DEA announcing its intentions to expand the production capacity of approved research cannabis cultivation sites. In his response, he said, quote, "We have some international treaty obligations that may not allow the way that marijuana has been handled from the grow facilities to the researchers. It's something that I'm very aware of. It's something that I'm trying to push," end quote. Despite an effort by multiple institutions to apply, no additional sites have been approved yet. And I think this highlights a serious inefficiency in the way that the world in general regulates drugs and a problem with international treaties that are used to do so. My main gripe with policy like this is that it's totally unaccountable to the whims of the general populace in each individual member country. These are global coalitions. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs is enforced by the UN, which is unaccountable to whatever opinion the United States public has on legal cannabis, or even the federal government for that matter. This is a supranational coalition and a bureaucracy that US policy may influence by being a party to it, but by no means has the ability to change on its own. And if treaties to which we are obliged to adhere are stopping us from expanding the production capacity of facilities providing cannabis to researchers and actually fulfilling the promises that our own drug regulatory agencies have put forward for how they want to proceed with cannabis in the future in regards to research, then this is unacceptable in my opinion. Totally unacceptable. And this is precisely because it's absolutely impossible for the average citizen to have any say over not only what the global policy is on the matter, but how it influences U.S. federal policy on it. With this treaty in place, it makes it much more difficult for the U.S. federal government to justify changing the way that it regulates it, because it's frankly above their head. It has obligations to the UN, which it is a party to, and to this treaty, which it's been a party to since 1961. So it's very easy to put Senate Bill 420 out there, for example, but it's much more difficult to persuade the DEA, which is bound by international treaty obligations, to change the way that they regulate cannabis. It's a much deeper issue than simply changing the law in our country. It can be done, don't get me wrong, Canada did it, but the UN didn't particularly like it. Here's their statement on the matter. Vienna, 17th of October, UN Information Service. On the occasion of the entry into force of Bill C-45, which legalizes cannabis for non-medical purposes in Canada, the International Narcotics Control Board, or the INCB, reiterates its regret at the adoption of this measure by the Government of Canada. The legalization by Canada of cannabis for non-medical purposes is incompatible with the legal obligations incumbent on states parties under the International Drug Control Framework and is a violation of fundamental provisions of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, as amended by the 1972 Protocol, according to which state parties have undertaken to limit its production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use, and possession of drugs exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. The INCB maintains that by moving forward with the legalization of cannabis for non-medical purposes, in disregard of its legal obligations and diplomatic commitments, the Government of Canada has contributed to the weakening of the international drug control framework and the undermining of the rules-based international order. Speaking on behalf of the board, President Viraj Sumyai said, quote, "While the board is concerned about the impact of cannabis legalization in Canada on the international consensus embodied in the 3 United Nations Drug Control Conventions and the related commitments made by the international community at the special session of the General Assembly in 2016, it is also deeply concerned about the public health impact of these policy choices on the health and welfare of Canadians, particularly youth," end quote. So the UN is clearly not a fan of its member states deciding themselves to buck the system on how the global consensus has determined cannabis has to be regulated. And frankly, I don't think that global consensus should really govern how we regulate drugs. In the 2006 decision, Gonzalez v. Rake, the dissent said the following about the importance of sovereignty and the dangers of top-down control of drugs, in particular cannabis, because that was the topic of the case. "We enforce the outer limits of Congress's Commerce Clause authority not for their own sake, but to protect historic spheres of state sovereignty from excessive federal encroachment and thereby to maintain the distribution of power fundamental to our federal system of government. One of federalism's chief virtues, of course, is that it promotes innovation by allowing for the possibility that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experience without risk to the rest of the country," end quote. And I would like to extrapolate this opinion to global control over drug regulation as well. If a single country decides that they want to go against the consensus of the overarching global authority, they can make themselves the guinea pigs and serve as a model that other countries, and indeed the world, could use to critically analyze the effects of, for example, legal cannabis. The UN has clearly taken a consensus is best approach to this matter, but I think it's really telling that they think that the rules are more important than actually looking at how cannabis manifests in the real world and pontificating over its dangers, while at the same time renouncing the virtue of trial and error through legislative action and public consensus on an issue, finding a way to make it work, and at the same time, just as happens with things like tobacco and alcohol, mitigate the risks in other ways than keeping it illegal and rigidly controlling its use through legal force against the consensus of the people that actually make up the member states, that make up the UN. And they clearly don't value the opinion of sovereign countries and of the opinions of the individuals that make up those countries. They clearly value their own rules, their own unaccountable bureaucracy, more than the sovereignty of individual member states. And this is frankly not surprising because they are a global coalition that works above the level of state sovereignty. And their jobs are not exactly forced to be held to account by the individual members of those member states. It simply does not concern them in any capacity of what their job entails. They are not forced to interact with the public. They are not voted in by the public. They are not forced to compromise with the public. And they do not seem to care what the public thinks, and frankly would rather postulate about what might happen and about the dangers, the potential dangers to the youth and to Canadians, rather than actually analyze what does happen in these individual laboratories of legal change. And frankly, this is something that I think needs to go. It's already hard enough to deal with the unaccountable bureaucracies in our own drug regulatory agencies in our own countries through people that we do not elect, that do not have to interact with the public in any capacity or answer to their demands. They do not have to care what they think about recreational legalization because they don't answer to the public. They answer to the people who appoint them, and the public does not really pay a lot of attention, frankly, to the leadership of the DEA, the FDA, or the Attorney General. And even if they did, it wouldn't really matter anyways because the public does not have any say on who they appoint or whether they get appointed or whether they actually get confirmed for the job to which they get appointed. And even if we get to a point where we convince the federal government to legalize cannabis for recreational purposes, and also have the drug regulatory agencies that enforce cannabis change their priorities and focus on enforcing compliance to a legal framework, then we still have another hurdle to get over, which is our obligation or perceived obligation to these treaties. Whether they actually cause our legislators and drug regulatory agencies to keep the law the way it is, or whether their interaction with that policy is actually enforceable, doesn't really matter because we see complying with that framework as an obligation and something that we need to adhere to. And until that changes, much like it did with Canada, I believe that these international treaties will be an obstacle to cannabis legalization in America. I also think, though, that understanding how these frameworks affect our federal government's ability to move forward and make their own promises reality will result in the overall respect for these regulatory frameworks to degrade. And I think this is a good thing personally. Anyways, that's about all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, drop a thumbs up down below and let's keep this discussion going in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more, and until next time, stay meducated.